July 25th, 2024, 11:47 in the morning, Culiacan, Sinaloa. The air over the city smells the way it always does in late July, thick with diesel exhaust, rotting mangoes, and the particular metallic heat of asphalt baking under a sun that has no interest in mercy. Ismael El Mayo Zambada is 76 years old. He has survived in the narco world for more than 5 decades. He has never been arrested. Not once. Not ever. Not by Mexican federales. Not by American DEA agents who have spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars trying to get their hands on him. Not by rival cartels who would have paid fortunes to know his location on any given afternoon. For 50-plus years, El Mayo has moved through this world like smoke, present, powerful, impossible to catch. He is the last original patriarch of the Sinaloa cartel. He co-founded the organization that would come to control, by DEA estimates, roughly 30% of all cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl entering the United States at the peak of its power. He is, by any serious measure, one of the most consequential drug traffickers in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And today, someone he trusts completely is about to put him on a plane. What Zambada does not know, cannot know, because the man sitting across from him has spent months arranging every detail of this moment, is that the plane is not going where he was told it was going. The meeting he was invited to attend does not exist. The allies waiting for him at the other end are not allies. The man who invited him, who vouched for the destination, who sat beside him in the vehicle that drove them to the airstrip, is Joaquín Guzmán López, the fourth son of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, a man El Mayo has known since childhood, a man whose father built the Sinaloa cartel alongside him, a man who, by every rule of the world they both inhabit, owes him loyalty of the most absolute and unconditional kind. The plane lands in New Mexico. Federal agents are waiting on the tarmac. How does the son of the world's most famous drug lord arrange the capture of his father's oldest partner and walk away from it? How do you betray a man who has survived every enemy the world has sent against him for half a century? What does it mean when the greatest threat to the most powerful cartel in the world turns out to be someone who grew up inside it? And the question that nobody, not prosecutors, not journalists, not the DEA, has fully answered: was Joaquín Guzmán López working alone? Or was the American government watching this happen in real time? What you are about to hear in the next several minutes is the most consequential internal betrayal in the history of organized crime in North America. This is the story behind the story, told using federal court documents, DEA intelligence, and the uncomfortable silences in the official record that say as much as the words do. To understand what happened on that airstrip in July of 2024, you have to understand what the Sinaloa cartel actually, not the version that appears in Netflix series and DEA press releases, but the structural, historical, human reality of an organization that for 3 decades has operated as something closer to a multinational corporation than a street gang. And to understand that, you have to go back to the beginning, to 2 men, and to the specific geography of northwestern Mexico that made them both possible. The Sierra Madre Occidental is a mountain range that runs roughly 1,000 miles down the western spine of Mexico. Jagged, isolated, extraordinarily difficult to navigate. The region known as the Golden Triangle, where Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua converge in the High Sierra, has been producing opium poppies since at least the 1920s, when Chinese immigrant laborers planted the first crops in the remote valleys. The federal government in Mexico City has always struggled to maintain authority in these mountains. The terrain makes enforcement nearly impossible. The poverty makes alternatives nearly non-existent. And the tradition, spanning generations, of growing and moving product out of the Sierra makes the narco economy not an aberration, but a cultural inheritance passed from grandfather to father to son. Ismael Zambada Garcia was born in El Alamo, Sinaloa, on the 1st of January, 1948. His family were farmers. He grew up in the foothills with almost nothing: no electricity, no running water, no expectation of a different life. By the time he was a teenager, the pathways out of the Sierra were already well established. You grew crops, you connected with the men who moved them, and if you were smart enough and ruthless enough and patient enough, you eventually became one of those men yourself. El Mayo was all three. What distinguished him from others who traveled the same early path was a particular quality that people who worked with him over the decades would describe in almost identical terms. He was calm, not cold, not detached. Calm. He made decisions without panic. He thought in decades rather than months. He never raised his voice when a quiet word would accomplish more. Joaquín Guzmán Loera, El Chapo, was born 11 years later in 1957 in La Tuna, a village in the Badiraguato municipality of Sinaloa. His family were also farmers, also poor, also embedded in the same Sierra culture that had been producing traffickers for 3 generations. El Chapo's trajectory was different from Mayo's in one fundamental respect. Where Mayo was patient and invisible, Chapo was aggressive and audacious. He had an appetite for spectacle, for the kind of bold moves that built legends quickly and created enemies even faster. What Mayo built quietly over years, Chapo could build loudly in months. What Chapo built loudly in months, Mayo could hold together when the inevitable storms came. They met through Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, El Padrino, the man who effectively organized all Mexican drug trafficking in the 1980s, into a single federated structure known as the Guadalajara Cartel. Félix Gallardo was the architect, the godfather in the original sense, the man who divided territories, resolved disputes, and maintained the fiction that the various regional operators were all one family. When Félix Gallardo was arrested in 1989, his structure fractured. The Arellano Félix brothers took Tijuana. The Carrillo Fuentes family took Ciudad Juárez. And in Sinaloa, the territory that would eventually dominate them all, Guzmán and Zambada began building what would become the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the history of the Americas. Their partnership was not a friendship in any conventional sense. It was something more durable than friendship and more functional than alliance. They were complementary forces, the aggressive and the patient, the visible and the invisible. El Chapo provided the boldness that made the organization legendary and attracted the street-level loyalty that every criminal empire requires. El Mayo provided the infrastructure, the institutional memory, the long view. When Chapo was captured in 2014 and extradited to the United States in 2017, sentenced in 2019 to life plus 30 years in a federal supermax in Florence, Colorado, El Mayo kept the organization running, quietly, invisibly, as he always had. By the time we reach 2024, Ismael Zambada is 76 years old and has never spent a single night in a jail cell anywhere in the world. That fact alone, that extraordinary, almost implausible fact, tells you something essential about the man. In a world where almost everyone eventually falls, he had not fallen. He was the last one standing of his entire generation. And that record, that half-century of survival, was about to be ended, not by a government operation, not by a rival cartel, not by the slow attrition of age, but by a 29-year-old man who had grown up calling him Uncle. Joaquín Guzmán López was born in 1994, the fourth of El Chapo's 6 sons with his second wife, Griselda López Pérez. He grew up in the specific gravity field of his father's name, a field that distorts everything it touches. To be a son of Joaquín Guzmán Loera is to inhabit a particular kind of inheritance, enormous protection and enormous danger in exactly equal measure. The cartel's reach extended to every corner of your life, which meant you were always safe from ordinary threats and never safe from extraordinary ones. The name was armor. The name was also a target. El Chapo's sons are collectively known in Mexico as Los Chapitos, a term that oscillates between affectionate diminutive and something more ominous depending on the context and the speaker. The 4 brothers who became operationally significant within the Sinaloa cartel are Iván Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, Ovidio, and Joaquín. They were raised to be heirs. When their father was first captured in 2014, and then again in 2015 before his famous tunnel escape, the brothers began taking on larger roles. When he was extradited to the United States in January of 2017, a handover that El Chapo himself later claimed he was not informed of in advance, a claim that suggests the depth of distrust even within the organization's highest levels, the sons stepped fully into operational command. What was publicly known about Joaquín Guzmán López before July of 2024 was relatively little compared to his brothers. Iván and Alfredo were the ones who showed up in narco corridos, who generated the spectacular acts of violence, most notoriously the October 2019 incident in Culiacán, when Mexican security forces briefly detained Ovidio and then released him within hours after the city erupted in coordinated armed attacks that killed multiple people and left the government looking completely incapable of enforcing its own authority. That incident, known in Mexico simply as El Culiacanazo, demonstrated that Los Chapitos had achieved something their father never quite managed: the ability to hold a state capital hostage long enough to reverse a federal arrest. It was an extraordinary display of raw power, and it made Ovidio, Iván, and Alfredo the faces of the new generation. Joaquín operated more quietly. He was understood to manage logistics, supply chains, transportation corridors, the operational machinery that keeps a trafficking organization moving product across borders without detection. He had indictments in the United States on drug trafficking and conspiracy charges, as did all his brothers. He had a price on his head, also like his brothers, but he was not the one generating headlines. He was, in the parlance of the organization, a worker, a significant worker connected to enormous resources and violent enforcement capacity, but not primarily a figure of spectacle. And here is where this story turns into something nobody fully anticipated, because the quiet brother, the logistics man, the one operating in the background, that was precisely the profile that allowed him to do what he did. The question almost nobody has thought to ask is this: what does it take to betray the man your father considered a brother, and do it successfully enough that you walk away rather than end up in a ditch in the Sinaloan foothills? Because betrayal of that magnitude, at that level, doesn't happen on impulse. It requires months of preparation, access to the highest levels of American law enforcement, and a calculation so cold it's almost impossible to reconcile with any conventional notion of family loyalty. Keep that in mind, because the answer to how he pulled it off is going to tell you everything about what the Sinaloa cartel actually was underneath the legend. By 2023, the internal landscape of the Sinaloa cartel was under stresses that were not visible from the outside, but were structural and severe. The organization had 2 centers of gravity that had increasingly different interests. On one side were Los Chapitos, the sons, aggressive, willing to engage in the fentanyl trade, in ways the previous generation had resisted, generating massive revenue but also generating unprecedented American law enforcement attention. On the other side was El Mayo's faction, older, more traditional, more aligned with the cocaine and heroin economy that had built the cartel, more cautious about the specific heat that fentanyl was drawing from DEA, from the U.S. Congress, from the political architecture that was connecting Mexican drug trafficking to the American overdose crisis, in ways that made the entire enterprise more federally radioactive than it had ever been before. This tension was not simply a conflict of business philosophy. It was a succession crisis. El Chapo was in a supermax cell in Florence, Colorado, where he will almost certainly spend the rest of his life. The man who had been the cartel's emotional center, its most recognizable face, its mythology, he was gone. The partnership between the Guzmán family and the Zambada family that had held the organization together for 30 years was now a relationship between a 76-year-old survivor and a group of young men who had grown up in his shadow and might have very different ideas about how the next 30 years should look. Federal court documents from the Southern District of New York, specifically the superseding indictment filed against Joaquín Guzmán López and the cooperation agreement documents that have been partially unsealed, reveal details about the timeline of his engagement with American authorities that had not previously been made public. And those details are where the story stops being a narco-drama and becomes something more complicated. What the documents confirm is this: Joaquín Guzmán López had been in some form of communication with the Drug Enforcement Administration for a period of time before the events of July 2024. The specific parameters of that communication, when it began, what was offered, what was asked, remain partially redacted. Federal prosecutors in New York have not been fully transparent about the sequence of events, and the precise role of American government agencies in the planning of the Zambada handover is a question that prosecutors themselves have been reluctant to answer directly in open court proceedings. But the cooperation agreement is real. The guilty plea in which Guzmán López admitted to conspiracy to import and distribute narcotics was entered in federal court. And the terms of that plea, which have been partially disclosed, make clear that his cooperation was substantial and predated the July capture. Now stop, because before we go any further, you need to understand something that changes the entire frame of what you just heard. The DEA's official position, the position stated publicly by agency spokespersons in the days following the Zambada capture, was that the agency did not coordinate the handover in advance, that American authorities were not actively directing Guzmán López's actions, that what happened on that New Mexico airstrip was, in the official language, an unexpected opportunity that was exploited. But El Mayo's own statement, issued through his attorneys in the weeks after his capture, and later expanded in declarations filed with a Mexican court, says something categorically different. Zambada's attorneys state, and Zambada himself states, that he was deceived into boarding the plane, that he had no idea the destination was United States territory, that he was physically restrained, and that the sophistication of the operation, the coordination with American border officials, the immediate presence of DEA agents on the tarmac, the processing that began within minutes of landing, is not consistent with an improvised operation that surprised U.S. authorities. Somebody is not telling the full truth, and the gap between those two accounts, the American government's version and El Mayo's version, is where the most important question in this entire story lives. The secondary loop that opened with the question of Guzmán López's motivation can now close into something more specific. This was not simply a son trying to save himself from American prosecution, although that was part of it. The documents suggest a man who understood, with precise clarity, that the architecture of the cartel he had grown up in was about to be restructured by forces outside his control, and that the only way to maintain any leverage in that restructuring was to offer something no one else could offer. Not product, not roots, not financial intelligence. Something more valuable than all of those. The man who had never been caught. The living proof that the Sinaloa cartel could survive anything. Delivering El Mayo was not just a deal, it was a signal. It said, I can do what the American government has been trying to do for 30 years, and that makes me worth keeping alive. The airstrip that was used for the handover was a private facility approximately 30 miles outside Culiacan. According to accounts reconstructed from testimony and investigative reporting by Proceso and other Mexican outlets with established DEA sources, the meeting that El Mayo believed he was attending was framed as a dispute resolution session, a sit-down between senior Sinaloa figures to address some of the internal tensions that had been building between the Zambada and Guzmán factions. This framing was specifically designed to appeal to the role El Mayo had always played in the organization. The peacemaker, the steady hand, the man who resolved conflicts so they didn't become wars. He was brought in other words, by weaponizing his own best quality against him. His willingness to sit down, to talk, to hold the organization together, that was the mechanism of his capture. The drive to the airstrip, the moment the plane's destination became apparent. What happened in those minutes, whether Zambada understood immediately, whether there was a confrontation, whether anything was said between the two men, is not in the public record. What is in the public record is that 76-year-old Ismael Zambada Garcia, who had evaded every government on Earth for 50 years, landed in handcuffs at a private airfield in New Mexico and was immediately transferred to federal custody. By the following morning, the news had reached every corner of the criminal world in Mexico, and what happened next made the capture itself look almost like a minor event. Up to this point, Joaquín Guzmán López had delivered the impossible and walked into American federal custody with a deal already in place. But what seemed like the end of one chapter was only the opening move in a violence that would cost hundreds of lives. Because the cartel he had just split open from the inside was still standing, and it was about to turn on itself. Let's reorient where we are. Two men who together represented the Sinaloa cartel's entire institutional memory had just been removed from the board simultaneously. One to federal supermax, one to federal custody in New Mexico. The organization they left behind was not a unified body capable of absorbing this shock. It was two factions that had been managing attention for years, and the event of July 2024 did not resolve that tension. It detonated it. The Zambada faction's response to the capture of El Mayo was swift and unambiguous. In the weeks following the handover, armed confrontations between Zambada-aligned forces and Chapito-aligned forces began occurring throughout Sinaloa, in the foothills of the Sierra, in the agricultural flatlands around Los Mochis, in the streets of Culiacan itself. The conflict that Mexico analysts and U.S. intelligence had been monitoring with concern for years, the conflict between the old guard and the new generation, was now a shooting war. Mexican government estimates, along with reporting from organizations that track cartel violence in Sinaloa, would eventually put the death toll from the internal conflict that followed the July capture at somewhere between 200 and 400 people in the first 6 months alone. Some credible investigative journalism sources placed the figure higher. This number needs an image to become real. 200 and 400 deaths in 6 months in a single Mexican state. That is not a war happening somewhere abstract. Sinaloa is a state of approximately 3 million people. Culiacan, its capital, has a population of roughly 1 million. The violence that followed Guzmán López's betrayal did not happen in remote mountain villages. It happened in residential neighborhoods, on commercial streets, at the kinds of intersections where ordinary people drive their children to school. The character revelation that the payoff map delivers here is not about Guzmán López's courage or strategic brilliance. It is about the cost of his calculation. The deal he made in New Mexico had a price. He did not pay it personally. 300 people in Sinaloa paid it for him. What was happening structurally inside the organization during this period? The Zambada faction, led by El Mayo's sons, specifically his son Serafin and others within his network, was attempting to retaliate both militarily and politically. Militarily meant gunfights and targeted assassinations in the Sierra and in the city. Politically meant something more complicated. It meant contacting authorities, both Mexican and American, with information that could be used against Los Chapitos. The logic of cartel warfare in the 21st century is not purely kinetic. It is also informational. You use the government as a weapon against your enemy when your enemy is too strong to defeat in a direct confrontation. And the Zambada faction, having just lost its patriarch to the most humiliating betrayal in cartel history, was not in a position for direct confrontation against the Guzmán sons and their resources. But there was a problem with the Zambada faction's retaliation strategy, a problem that sits at the center of the largest unanswered question in this entire episode. And to understand that problem, we need to understand something about what Joaquín Guzmán López actually offered the American government, and what the American government may have already known before he offered it. There is a version of this story that American federal authorities would like you to believe. It goes like this: Joaquín Guzmán López, facing substantial criminal exposure and motivated by self-preservation, reached out to DEA contacts, offered cooperation, and eventually arranged the surprise capture of El Mayo Zambada as the culminating act of that cooperation. American agents, presented with this unexpected opportunity, acted quickly and professionally. The system worked. A 50-year fugitive was brought to justice. Justice was served. There is another version, and this version is supported not by conspiracy theory but by the specific silences in the public record, by what Zambada's attorneys have said on the record, and by the testimony of people close to both organizations who have spoken to journalists in Mexico with documented track records of accurate cartel reporting. This version goes like this. The communication between Guzmán López and American law enforcement was not a spontaneous cooperation arrangement that led to an improvised capture. It was a structured negotiation, conducted over months, in which the handover of El Mayo Zambada was not a surprise bonus. It was the central deliverable. The American government knew what was coming. Elements within U.S. law enforcement helped coordinate the operational details. And the official story that this was an unexpected development was constructed after the fact to avoid the legal and political complications that would arise from acknowledging that the United States government had, in effect, participated in a kidnapping of a foreign national on Mexican soil, without notifying, let alone obtaining the cooperation of the Mexican government. But there's a part of this story we haven't fully told you yet. Because the question of American government involvement doesn't just matter for legal reasons. It matters because of what it reveals about the fundamental transactional nature of American drug war policy in Mexico over the past 3 decades. This is not the first time that the DEA has cultivated informants within the Sinaloa cartel. It is not the first time that the American government's relationships with specific cartel actors have been used to neutralize other cartel actors, with all the moral complications that entails. The most documented example before this one was the DEA's relationship with Sinaloa leadership during the Felipe Calderón government. a relationship that Mexican investigators and journalists alleged involved the DEA providing operational intelligence that helped Sinaloa defeat the Juarez and Beltran Leyva cartels, in exchange for cooperation on specific interdictions and intelligence sharing. The DEA has always denied the most operational elements of these allegations, but the pattern is established. The relationship between the American drug enforcement apparatus and the Sinaloa cartel has never been simply adversarial. Now comes what no major outlet has published in full. Joaquín Guzmán López's cooperation agreement, according to sources familiar with its contents, extends substantially beyond the Zambada handover. The information he has provided to American prosecutors covers not only drug trafficking operations and route intelligence, but also money laundering architecture, political corruption networks within multiple Mexican states, and, most significantly, detailed intelligence on the operational security methods that allowed the Sinaloa cartel to function with relative impunity for so many years. He is, in the assessment of experienced federal prosecutors, one of the most valuable cooperating witnesses the DEA has developed against any major trafficking organization in at least 15 years. The value of that cooperation is precisely why his treatment stands in such contrast to the treatment of every other major cartel defendant in American federal history. Ovidio Guzmán López, his brother, was extradited to the United States in April of 2023, and his case has proceeded through the standard prosecutorial pipeline. Joaquín remains in federal custody under conditions that suggest his cooperation is active and ongoing. He attends court proceedings. He is, as of the most recent public record, not incarcerated in a facility consistent with his legal exposure. He is being managed as an asset. Think about this for a moment. The man who triggered a civil war inside the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the Western Hemisphere, a civil war that left hundreds of people dead in the streets and hillsides of Sinaloa, is currently in American federal custody under what appear to be relatively favorable conditions, cooperating with prosecutors against targets whose names and positions in the cartel hierarchy he knows in extraordinary detail. The people who died in Culiacan's residential neighborhoods in the fall of 2024, they are not part of the deal. They are the externalities. The math that Joaquín Guzmán López did in 2023 or 2022, whenever he first picked up the phone and called his DEA contact, did not include them in the equation. The first week of September 2024, Culiacán. According to reporting from Proceso and from the investigative team at Rio Doce, the Sinaloa-based outlet whose journalists have reported on cartel violence at personal risk for 2 decades, the city had by this point developed a particular texture of fear that veteran residents described as different in kind from previous periods of violence. This was not the spectacular public violence of the Calderon years, the choreographed shootouts designed to demonstrate territorial dominance. This was something more intimate and more disorienting. Targeted killings of mid-level operators, disappearances of logistics coordinators. The bodies of men who had worked within the organization for years, found in vehicles in parking structures or on dirt roads in the Ejido communities outside the city. The violence had the quality of a purge, systematic, list-driven, designed to remove specific nodes from a network rather than to terrorize a population. The Zambada faction was being dismantled with a precision that suggested the people doing the dismantling had detailed knowledge of its structure. And here is the element of this story that makes everyone who has studied it closely genuinely uncomfortable. That precision is exactly what you would expect if one side of the internal war had access to intelligence about the other side's organizational chart. Intelligence of the kind that a cooperating federal witness in active communication with American law enforcement might be able to provide. There is no document in the public record that proves Joaquín Guzmán López was sharing organizational intelligence about Zambada's faction with American authorities, who were then passing it to allies within the Chapito faction. That would be something categorically different from what any federal agency would publicly acknowledge. But the pattern of violence in those months, its selectivity, its speed, its accuracy, is a fact. And the question of how that pattern was possible, given the operational security that experienced cartel figures maintain, is a question that sits in the public record unanswered. And now, here, in the early fall of 2024, we arrive at the moment where the myth finally collapses. Not Zambada's myth, though that had already collapsed on a New Mexico airstrip in July. The myth that collapses in September of 2024 is the myth of the Sinaloa cartel itself. The organization that El Mayo and El Chapo built across 3 decades had always depended on one specific, non-negotiable internal logic: that the partnership at the top was unbreakable, that whatever conflicts existed at lower levels could always be resolved by the 2 patriarchs who had more to gain from cooperation than from war. This logic was not sentimental. It was functional. The cartel's power came from its coherence, its capacity to move product at scale, to maintain relationships with Colombian suppliers, and with the street-level distribution networks in American cities, to manage the political relationships that kept it operational. All of that depended on the organization operating as a single entity rather than as competing fragments. The myth collapsed not in a battlefield, but in a statement. In the weeks after the capture, Joaquín Guzmán López gave interviews, through intermediaries and eventually directly, in which he described the internal dynamics of the organization with a candor that no senior Sinaloa figure had ever permitted himself publicly. He described factional conflict. He described financial disputes. He described, in terms that were unmistakably intended to be heard by both American prosecutors and Mexican audiences, the degree to which the organization he had grown up in had already fragmented before his actions completed the fracture. The man who was supposed to carry the Guzmán legacy into a 3rd generation of Sinaloa dominance was instead providing the most detailed public autopsy of that legacy ever recorded. Ismael Zambada, 76 years old, sitting in a federal detention facility in the United States, had spent 50 years being the man who held everything together. In court filings submitted through his attorneys, he described what he experienced on July 25, 2024, in terms that were stripped of cartel mythology and reduced to something almost unbearably human. He was an old man who had been deceived by someone he loved like family. He had walked into a room, gotten into a vehicle, and found himself on a plane to a country whose government had been trying to arrest him for 30 years. He had not been captured. He had been delivered. There is a specific entry in the federal court record, a declaration submitted by Zambada's legal team, in which his attorneys describe their client's state of mind upon arriving in American custody. The language is formal and legal, but underneath the formal language, if you read it carefully, you can see the thing that makes this story more than a narco-drama. An old man who built his entire life on the principle that loyalty was the only currency that couldn't be counterfeited, discovering at 76 that he had been wrong. Let's take stock of where the narrative has brought us. Zambada is in federal custody in the United States, facing charges that carry life sentences. Guzmán López is in federal custody under an active cooperation agreement, the terms of which remain partially sealed. The Sinaloa cartel, the organization that at its peak controlled distribution networks spanning 41 countries, according to DEA analysis, and generated estimated annual revenues of between $3 and $6 billion, has fractured into what investigators describe as at minimum 2 competing organizations, possibly 3 or 4, with the specific territorial map of that fragmentation still being drawn in violence. The climax loop that opened with the question of American government complicity can now be addressed with what the record actually supports. In the months following the July capture, the U.S. Department of Justice declined multiple times in response to specific questions from journalists and in response to motions filed by Zambada's attorneys to disclose the full operational details of the coordination between Guzmán López and American law enforcement that preceded the capture. A federal judge in the case ordered partial disclosure of the cooperation agreement. What was disclosed confirmed that the DEA's relationship with Guzmán López was not a new development that emerged reactively in the days before July 25th. It was an established, documented relationship with a defined structure and defined deliverables. What remains sealed, and what Zambada's legal team has specifically argued should be disclosed, is the question of whether American law enforcement officials were given advance notice specific enough that they had the ability to prevent the operation if they chose to, or to disclose it to Mexican authorities, and chose to do neither. This question has implications that extend far beyond this specific case. It goes to the architecture of how the United States government conducts drug enforcement operations in a sovereign foreign country. Mexico's government, specifically the López Obrador administration at the time of the capture, and the subsequent Sheinbaum administration, was not notified. Mexico City found out about the capture of one of its most wanted individuals the same way the public did, through news reports. The Mexican government's response was, diplomatically speaking, furious. The foreign minister issued formal complaints. The Attorney General's office demanded explanations. Multiple Mexican officials described the operation in terms that stopped just short of calling it a violation of Mexican sovereignty. Terms that, given the diplomatic context, were about as close to a formal accusation as official language permits. The deeper irony, and this irony the narrator does not need to underline because it is visible in the plain facts, is that the United States government, which has spent decades criticizing Mexico for its failure to apprehend drug traffickers, may have executed its most spectacular narco capture of the 21st century in a way that was itself of questionable legal and diplomatic propriety. But there is a layer beneath the diplomatic conflict that matters more to the long-term story. Because the fragmentation of the Sinaloa cartel does not mean the elimination of Sinaloa cartel power. Criminal organizations don't simply disappear when their leadership is removed. They reorganize. They adapt. The routes don't vanish. The distribution networks in American cities don't dissolve. The money that has been accumulated and invested and laundered over 30 years doesn't evaporate. What the fragmentation of the Sinaloa cartel produces in the operational assessment of DEA analysts is not less trafficking. It is the same volume of trafficking, or potentially more, conducted by more numerous and less disciplined organizations that are harder to monitor, harder to negotiate with, and more prone to the kind of spectacular violence that generates pressure on both governments. The capture of El Mayo Zambada in this analysis may make American streets marginally safer in the very short term and substantially more dangerous in the medium term, as the territorial wars that follow Sinaloa's fragmentation play out in the border cities and distribution hubs where those wars always land. There is a detail in the court record that has received less attention than it deserves. In the cooperation agreement documents, specifically in the sections describing the nature of information Guzmán López has provided to American authorities, there are references to intelligence concerning fentanyl supply chains that significantly predate his formal cooperation. This is material of enormous potential value. The American fentanyl crisis, which claimed over 100,000 American lives in 2022 alone, one every 5 minutes, around the clock, every day of that year, has been documented by DEA as primarily Sinaloa supplied. The precursor chemicals come from China. The synthesis happens in Sinaloa laboratories. The distribution happens through the same networks that have been moving heroin and cocaine for 30 years. What Guzmán López apparently provided to federal prosecutors was not simply organizational intelligence about people and places. It was process intelligence, the supply chain architecture that allows fentanyl to be produced at the scale required to kill 100,000 Americans a year. The value of this information to American law enforcement is, in the assessment of people familiar with DEA operations, extraordinary. It is the kind of intelligence that took years to accumulate, even with the most aggressive conventional enforcement efforts. And it was provided by a man who had helped build and operate the system he was now describing. The final revelation that the payoff structure of this story delivers is not about violence or betrayal or cartel politics. It is about this. What does it mean that the most valuable intelligence about the mechanism killing 100,000 Americans per year was sitting inside the head of a man who needed an incentive to share it? What does it mean about the nature of the American drug enforcement enterprise that the most productive relationship they have developed against the fentanyl supply chain is a cooperation agreement with one of the men who helped build it? These are not rhetorical questions designed to make the DEA look bad. They are genuine structural observations about the architecture of drug enforcement in a world where the intelligence required to disrupt supply chains lives inside the organizations you are trying to disrupt. And the only way to access it is to offer something that makes sharing it worth the risk. After everything you have just heard, the question that this story leaves open is genuinely divisive. Was Joaquín Guzmán López a man who made a rational calculation, trading his freedom and his cooperation for the only thing that could save him from a life sentence, and accepting the secondary consequences as the unavoidable cost of that calculation? Or is he something else? A man who understood, with a clarity that should disturb us, that the American government's appetite for symbolic victories in the drug war is large enough to absorb almost any deal on almost any terms, if the trophy at the end is significant enough. And if that second reading is accurate, what does it say about the system that made that deal possible? Drop your answer in the comments, because the people who have studied this case most closely are genuinely divided, and the question has no clean answer. In the end, Ismael Zambada's 50 years of perfect invisibility were not defeated by a government. They were defeated by trust, by the specific trust he placed in a young man who had grown up at his table, in his world, under his protection. A young man who turned that trust into the most precise weapon in a cartel arsenal: access. And what Zambada built across 5 decades, the reputation, the network, the institutional weight of being the man who was never caught, all of that became, in the end, the mechanism of his capture. His survival record made him valuable enough to be worth betraying. His trust made him reachable. His role as peacemaker made him show up. The real cost of what happened in July of 2024 is not measured in the careers of the 2 men who landed on that New Mexico airstrip. El Mayo will spend the rest of his life in American federal custody. Guzmán López will spend the rest of his life in some version of the American witness protection infrastructure, in a deal that prosecutors will defend as necessary, and critics will describe as a bargain with consequences we have not finished counting. The real cost is measured in the streets of Culiacán, in the families of the 300-plus people who died in the fratricidal violence that followed, in the accelerated fragmentation of an organization whose discipline, however brutal, at least imposed a kind of structure on the narco economy of northwestern Mexico. The people who paid the price for this story are not in any federal courthouse. They are in cemeteries in Sinaloa. The question that remains, the one with no easy answer, the one that the sealed sections of the cooperation agreement cannot resolve, and that no amount of DEA press releases will fully address, is this. When a government achieves a historic capture through a process it will not fully disclose, using a partner it will not fully characterize, producing consequences it will not fully acknowledge, what exactly has been accomplished? Was this justice? Was this policy? Was this a transaction that served American interests at the expense of Mexican lives? Or is that distinction between justice and transaction one that the architecture of the drug war has made impossible to maintain? Joaquín Guzmán López wanted to survive. He found the one thing that could guarantee it, that he found it inside an American federal cooperation agreement, and that the American government found in him the thing it had wanted for 30 years, says something about both of them, and about the world that made each of them what they are. In a world where loyalty is the most expensive currency, it turns out the most reliable buyer has always been the government. And the price, as always, was paid by someone else. What do you make of this deal? Was Guzmán López a calculated survivor, or a man who destroyed something irreplaceable for a personal exit? And the harder question, does the American government's role in this story make it a partner in justice, or something more complicated? Let us know what you think in the comments. This is the kind of story where the debate is as important as the facts. If you made it this far, it's because this story matters to you, because you understand that what happened in a New Mexico airfield in July of 2024 isn't just a narco story. It's a story about power, about betrayal, about the price of survival in a world where the rules are written by whoever is still standing. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. No speculation, no filler. Just the stories that actually happened, told the way they deserve to be told. This is where the real stories live, the ones behind the headlines. And the main loop that opened with the question of whether the American government knew, the answer, based on everything in the public record, is almost certainly yes. The question that remains sealed, the question that may never be fully answered in open court, is not whether they knew, it's how much they helped.